Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Martin Puchner. He is the Byron and Anita Wien Professor of Drama and of English and Comparative Literature at Harvard University. He serves as the founding director of the Mellon School of Theatre and Performance Research at Harvard University. He is the author of several books, and today we're going to focus on his latest one, The Language of Thieves. My family's obsession with the secret code the Nazis tried to eliminate. So, Dr. Puchner, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thanks for having me, Ricardo.
Okay, so this language of thieves is Rotwelsch, right? Is that the correct pronunciation?
It is, as far as anyone can tell.
Okay, so that's interesting. So we are not sure how people pronounce the words in this language.
Of course, because the language is so old, it goes back to the Middle Ages. It's very hard to know how people pronounced it. Though I shouldn't say it's not that we have no idea. There are some ancient languages like cuneiform, Assyrian cuneiforms that no one really knows how to pronounce. The same is not true of Rotwelsch, in part because most of the speakers had a German language background, though they would be also speaking extremely different dialects at different times. So we can imagine a whole range of pronunciations.
So tell us more about the background for this language. I mean, what is this language? Where did it start? Who spoke it?
Yeah, so it as I mentioned, really goes back many hundreds of years. The first indications of it are come from the Middle Ages, and so it is very old, and it's spoken primarily in German-speaking Central Europe, broadly construed. So from the Rhine to Prague, that would be sort of the geographic area. So there in further east, there would be more Slavic influences, but it's basically within German-speaking Central Europe since the Middle Ages. That's the sort of geographic and historical, these are the two axes. Now, and you ask who spoke it. So that now it becomes really interesting because there are a lot of misconceptions, and it's at the same time hard to know. So it was essentially, I like to think of it as a language of the road. So it was basically for people who didn't have a fixed home, who found themselves on the road. And so who were these people? They could be journeymen who were traveling from master to apprentice themselves to different masters and who had sort of fallen out of that lifestyle. I have biographies like that, or someone who is a cobbler apprentice, becomes a journeyman, starts to fight with his masters, and somehow realizes that there is a whole nother life that could be had, the life of the road, and so drifts into that lifestyle, for example. Or escaped convicts, or people who drop out of settled life for one reason or another. One big peak in this population, for example, came in Central Europe, came in the aftermath of the 30 Years' War, which caused huge populations to be displaced, to be homeless. Their villages burned down. They found themselves on the road. So there are many, many reasons why someone might find themselves in that itinerant lifestyle, in that sort of vagabond lifestyle. And that's when these speakers would be introduced to this language of the road and start speaking it.
So it's not really the case that we can pinpoint precisely a specific place where it originated, or can we?
No, there isn't. No, that in fact, as so often with the origins of something, especially that's so old, it's very hard to pinpoint, especially since the language was a purely spoken language. So there are almost no written sources. So whenever the language sort of pops up in the written archive, it will be sort of for various complicated reasons that someone notes, oh, there's this strange language of the road that people speak. And usually the people who will write about it are also hostile to it. So we'll be very skeptical of it, or even instill fear in their readers. So it's very hard to pinpoint anything definite about its origins. All we know that suddenly in the Middle Ages, there are references to different authors who write and whose writings get preserved will make reference to it. And I can speak about some of them maybe in a second. And so it's more like it's under the radar screen for a long time of written language. And then it sort of pops up here and there. And then you have to sort of put together these different, very scant pieces of evidence and to create a picture, try to hypothesize where does it exist, how developed is it, and then as time goes on, there are a little bit more sources later on.
By the way, is this a language that's still with us today? Are there still speakers of this language nowadays?
That was a question that I had in my mind, and as maybe in a second we'll have more occasion to talk about, the reason why I got interested in this language is because I inherited this archive from my uncle who devoted his life to this language, and he introduced me to it when I was a child. And so I knew that he had still met some speakers of this language in the 70s when he did most of his research on this language. So, but I thought when I started this project that that language had basically disappeared. But then by the end, I realized that that was actually not true. And I was able to make indirect contact with a group of itinerants in Switzerland who spoke a kind of successor language to Rotwelsch, a language, an itinerant dialect or language that had a lot of Rotwelsch terms in it. So to my surprise, I realized that parts of the language, at least, still exist today.
But I mean, I would imagine that since its beginning, and particularly across the Middle Ages and to the modern times, I mean, it has been influenced by other languages as well, right?
Exactly. And so, this is a good moment to talk a little bit about what kind of language this is, because linguists would, strictly speaking, actually not call it a full language. They would call it a sociolect, and it's sometimes also called a professional language of the itinerant underground. So what that means is that it doesn't have its own grammar. So the grammar is imported from German. So German, in a sense, lends its grammar to this language. And then most of the terms and expressions and verbs, all these meaning-making entities, they are imported from other languages. So from German, a lot from Yiddish and via Yiddish Hebrew, from Czech, from Romani, the language of Sinti and Roma, from all different languages, even a little bit of Latin, because they were itinerant students who would also find themselves sometimes drifting into the underground. And they, of course, knew Latin. So it's a real language mixture. And then what happens, and that's what I found so interesting, is that when these different terms from all these different languages, including, of course, also German, arrive in this language, they change their meaning, they shift their meaning, so that even if you are a German speaker or a Yiddish speaker, to mention the two languages that donated the largest number of words to this language, you wouldn't understand what's going on. So it's this real combination of words, and then these words change their meaning and drift in meanings, or maybe sometimes the speakers deliberately hid their meanings, so created secret meanings, which is why it was often seen as a secret language.
Right, but the fact that this language drew influence from all of these sorts of languages like Yiddish, Hebrew, German, and so on, does it have anything to do with the fact that the people who developed this language were originally speakers of these other languages and came from these different sorts of origins?
You're absolutely right, Ricardo. So as far as we can tell, most speakers were not, the Rotwelsch was not their native tongue. Though I mentioned there are certain periods, like the aftermath of the 30-Year War, when there were such large groups sometimes groups of 50 or 100 people who would be roaming around as a group. And of course, children would be growing up in this milieu. So some children may have grown up bilingually, so to speak. And there's one source that suggests that. But for the most part, you would be, as I mentioned, you would be a member of a different class or society, let's say an apprentice, and you wouldn't know this language. And it's only once you drifted into this milieu, that's why it's called a sociolect, the language of a particular milieu, that you would be sort of inducted into it, and you would start to speak it as a kind of second language, so to speak. Yeah.
Is it that people can talk about everything using this language, or is it focused on particular topics that perhaps were important or useful for the users of this particular language?
That's a great question, and I would say mostly the latter. And this is interesting for me because it also means that the language is, in a sense, registers the kind of life the speaker's head. It's almost like a window a little bit into this otherwise very inaccessible world. So there are certain areas of experience that really dominate this language. And from that, you can sort of reverse engineer the life experience of their speaker. So for example, everything having to do with food, very important. What kind of food can you find in a certain area? Also, though, lots of words for police and being arrested, because these speakers often existed in a kind of gray area of illegality. They didn't have passports. Sometimes they were also in a criminal milieu. There's definitely overlap. And so they were always on the run from the police. So they had a lot of terms for being imprisoned, being chased by the police, different kinds of police, warning signs about aggressive policemen, ideas about which areas were more lenient towards itinerants than others. So all of that was also clearly expressed in the language. And as I said, from that, as a sort of researcher, someone who's trying to get a sense of the actual life experience, the language and the areas in which this language is particularly well developed, it is particularly interesting in that respect.
So do we know if this language is less complex in terms of its vocabulary, particularly in comparison to the languages which gave rise to it?
So less complex, it depends. I think that for the speakers, I think languages are tools in many ways. And so
Sure.
For these speakers, it was the language they needed. And so, so as I mentioned, for certain areas like running away from justice or dodging policemen, it was extremely complex, more complex probably than, the vocabulary of you and me have in that area. It was also the other feature that was important for these speakers is that it was sometimes seen as a secret language, and the police often thought that these speakers had deliberately created a secret language to escape detection from the police. I think that's not quite right. I don't think that's true. But I certainly think that the fact that this was a language specific to a particular milieu, it is like a jargon, and so it allowed these speakers to communicate very efficiently while being incomprehensible to an outsider. So, and that's true of any professional jargon. I'm a literary scholar. We use lots of jargon. I try not to, but nevertheless. And so, so I think just to speak of it in terms of complexity, I'm not always sure that that's the best way to do it. I would say, let's look at the way this language was used, what needs in the speakers and in the life they led, this language fulfilled, and these functions it fulfilled very well, better than other languages, which is why it probably emerged in the first place.
Yeah, I understand. Does it have a written form, or is it simply spoken?
Yeah, so the language was really a spoken language.
Okay.
So and that's why it's so hard to find any kind of documents about it. So so that's one problem. The second problem is, and I hinted to that before, that the documents that exist are usually hostile to the language. So to give you one example, one of the first larger texts that mention Rotwelsch and give us about 200 words from the language was written by Martin Luther. Edited by Martin Luther, who was very hostile to these itinerants, that's a source. It was a book called the Book of Vagrants, in which Martin Luther tried to warn people, upright citizens, about the kinds of tricks beggars use to trick burghers out of money, or to inspire a pity or something like that. So he warns them of these tricks beggars use to weasel you out of your money. And so he, in the course of talking about it and warning people about it, he mentions this language and saying, you have to be careful. These people, these itinerants, have the secret language, and they can talk about you and you can understand what they're saying. So you better study up on Rotwelsch so that you can't be so easily tricked. That's the fantasy. That's one source, and there are lots of sources like that. So very hostile, and you have to be careful not to believe everything they say about the speakers. Mm-hmm. There's one fascinating source from the 19th century, and again, it's in a sense a very typical scene. So you have an itinerant who has been moving around Bohemia in what's now the Czech Republic, and he crosses into what's now Germany, and he's apprehended by the police in Jena, in Eastern Germany, because he doesn't have the right papers, and the police arrest him. They quickly realize that the passports he has are forged, and it turns out that he himself is a forger. Baumhauer, Ferdinand Baumhauer is his name. And so the police arrest them, and they realize also quickly that he's a Rotwelsch speaker, and they're always eager to understand this language better because they associate it with the criminal underground. So they arrest him, and they start to grill him for Rotwelsch terms. And then they realize that they are very lucky because he is a speaker of this language who actually knows how to read and write. It's not something that was that widespread in the itinerant underground. It was not a skill that was that important. But he, Baumhauer, knows how to read and write because he's actually a forger of passports. So that was sort of his profession, if you will, in the underground. So what the police do, they sit him down, they sit Baumhauer down and say, write us scenes from your underground world and write them in Rotwelsch. And so this is what Baumhauer does. He writes these scenes of life, just sort of little vignettes, but he writes them in Rotwelsch, and then he sort of adds a vocabulary list on the side so that these policemen can decipher it. And it's a very strange document. It's clear that Baumhauer gets into it, writing it, and so he ends up basically writing little plays, even with like stage directions and so on and so forth, even though it's just written for the police. But that's really more or less the only long source, written source of Rotwelsch, written by an actual Rotwelsch speaker. So it's sort of a fascinating document.
Right. Do we know if these people, these itinerants who spoke Rotwelsch, if they shared a common group identity? I mean, was there something like that? For example, did they think about themselves as some sort of society or culture?
Yes, I think they did, and this is one of the questions I had throughout this project, and I think it's one of the answer is yes. And again, I would say actually that there was this shared language played a big role in creating some kind of shared identity. So I think that's what language essentially creates. It creates a sense of shared community, and especially in this case was a community that was always on the run, that very, very hard life, the life of the road, and always prosecuted by the police. So all these external pressures, contributed to a sort of a sense of a shared lived experience, and the language contributed to that. And so the police, and this is, I think, the flip side, the more important flip side to the widespread idea that this is a secret language of thieves. From their perspective, it was really a community that was defined in part by your ability to speak this language. If you became part of this life, you were, in a sense, inducted into this language. And I would say there's a second piece of evidence, and that also comes back to your question about writing, because there's one other feature to this language, namely a kind of code of about 50 written signs. So they were not a written version of the language. They're not an alphabetic sign, but they were sort of, there were signs that they would leave on the side of the road or on certain houses or in the if you would enter a village, carved into a tree. That would communicate, that would allow other itinerants to navigate this terrain. So, for example, a sign like 5 bars, vertical bars, showed you have to be careful that you don't land in prison because there's an aggressive policeman. I like the sign of the cross means you have to act pious, and then you will be given some bread, or signs like that. And so that, I mean, they're wonderful sort of written version of this code of the road, so to speak. But for me, they're also a real sense of the solidarity of these speakers, because they were leaving them for one another, right? The person who carves that sign into a tree doesn't profit him or herself directly from it, but others do. And so I got, the more I studied these scanned sources, the more I did get a sense of a solidarity of the underground that's expressed in the language and in these written signs.
Mm-hmm. So tell us more about what got you interested in this language. I mean, what's the story behind it?
Yeah, it's a complicated and in many ways also difficult story that became part of the book as well. So as I mentioned, originally I got interested in this language because of my uncle, who was sort of a bohemian writer, poet, composer, who at some point in his life discovered this language and was so fascinated that he ended up basically dedicating his entire life to it. He did some field work, he studied the language, he collected expressions, he collected all the sources, including, for example, that one written source that I mentioned, the Baumhauer source, where he writes these Rotwelsch plays, or the Martin Luther treatise, this very aggressive treatise that was written against this language, all these different sources. And then he also starts to incorporate these Rotwelsch terms into his own poetry, and he even starts to translate bits of world literature into Rotwelsch, a language that, in a sense, he creates a literary version of this itinerant language. And so it's really, he wants to resuscitate this language, he wants to preserve it, he wants to promote it. He has all kinds of ideas associated with it. And so that's how I came to know about it and know parts of it as a child, growing up with it. So that's one part. And so this uncle unfortunately died very early in his 40s. And since I was the only one in the family to be really fascinated by this language, I inherited his archive. And have been sort of carrying it around with me for, I don't know, 25 years, always thinking, oh, I want to do something with it. This is this unique archive that I happen to have on this language that's more or less forgotten. I want people to know about it, in a sense, continuing my uncle's work. So that's one dimension. But then this sort of family history thread in the book also got a darker turn when I realized at some point why my uncle was so fascinated by this language, and that I'm pretty sure had to do with his father, my grandfather, who was a historian of names. And as I found out by accident, no one in the family either spoke about it or knew about it. It's unclear, probably a combination of the two. Actually was an early Nazi member of the Nazi party, and he wrote about very negatively about Yiddish, for example, and including, and I was so amazed to read that, and he attacked this language, this Rotwelsch language, because it's in his mind, in his sort of anti-Semitic mind, seemed to associate criminality because it was sort of a language of the underground, itinerant underground, and because there's so many Yiddish and Hebrew terms in it, with being Jewish, even though probably most speakers were not Jewish. But in any case, so that it turned out that my grandfather was, I had to discover this horrible past about him, but also that he was, in a way, the first member of my family to be interested in this strange underground language, albeit very negatively. And then I realized, okay, this must have to do with the fact that then his son, in a sense, I think as a kind of atonement, tried to dedicate his life to rescuing this language. Essentially, his father wanted to eliminate. So that became this very unexpected and dark search in the history of my family and its connection to the 20th century.
Yeah, very interesting. So, talking about historians of names, what does the history of names tell us about a specific language? I mean, by studying the history of names, what can we learn more about than the language those names are part of?
Yeah, it's, in a sense, that's exactly what my grandfather studied. So he called himself a historian of names.
Yeah.
He was mostly interested in place names, names of rivers and mountains and so on and so forth. And you can in some sense study history of migration through these these place names, and that's one of the things he did. And in these primarily, especially two articles that are so especially vile and anti-Semitic, he shows that the problem, it's not a real problem, but for his anti-Semitic mind, the problem for him was that there are some German-sounding Jewish names and Jewish-sounding German names, and for him, that was a confusion that needed to be solved. So he turned, for example, to the history of migration in places to say that a certain name, for example, Frankfurter, is usually a Jewish name because there's a large Jewish community in Frankfurt and had been for a long time. The Rhine was one of the first places in Central Europe to be settled by Jewish migrants. But that other names, for example, Nürnberger, was not usually a Jewish name because there's no Jewish settlement for a long time in Nuremberg. So that's how he approached it. Putting that fascinating. I agree. The history of names is really a fascinating history. It so happens that my grandfather put that scholarship to really terrible and also absolutely misguided use. So the history of place names would allows you to see patterns of migration, for example, and I think that's true. And the same goes with the history of personal names. You can see it's a way of it connects present speakers, people living today often with the distant past.
Right. Could you tell us more about when and how the history of Rotwelsch gets intertwined with the Nazis and the Nazi regime? Because I was trying to understand if this was something that even the higher ups of the Nazi regime were interested in. I mean, was this a general interest, or is it something that your grandfather particularly was interested in and it was more a sort of a niche thing, or not?
Very much the latter. It was much more of a niche thing. I mean, this language was very obscure. Very few people knew about it back then, just as almost no one knows about it now. So this is very much a niche thing. But essentially what my grandfather did was say, aha, this niche thing is connected to some of the larger political questions that are addressed and debated and that get talked about by the Nazis. For example, racial purity. He basically said, I can use my technique of tracing names, and I can help you Nazis distinguish according to your ideology who is German and who is Jewish. To put it in a nutshell. So he would say, okay, so your Nazis tried to, or we Nazis, because he became a member, trying to keep German pure from foreign influence. Here, let me give you a list of Rotwelsch terms that have filtered back into German. We need to eliminate those terms. So I think for example, he recommended that Jewish Germans should not be allowed to change their names. So he was very concerned about people hiding their identity by changing their names. So what he realized, and then he complains about how a lot of Rotwelsch speakers from that Rotwelsch milieu have assumed names or aliases or, names that are not their real names. So what he basically did is use this very obscure, very niche topic, as you say, and then try to make it important by connecting it to this Nazi ideology. I think so. I think to some extent, I mean, I don't know, I can't look into the soul of my grandfather. It may be that he was a completely committed anti-Semite and Nazi. I don't know. But it's also possible, and sometimes I like to believe it, because it makes him a little less bad, that it was sort of that he was an opportunist, that he knew something about this very obscure topic, history of names, and suddenly he felt like, oh, I see a way of making it relevant to to political powers and making it more important. So some combination perhaps of those two, but it was very much a niche topic, as you say, Ricardo, and but one that suddenly seemed to resonate in his mind with all these other political questions of race and identity and who is German, who is not German. And so, but you also ask about the history of it. And I would say he sort of comes at the tail end of a long history of anti-Semitic reactions to this language, a history that essentially starts with Martin Luther. This is why that early source is so important. And, it's well known, though not known enough, I think, just how anti-Semitic Martin Luther really was. And so it's one of the first sources about Rotwelsch, and it's a very negative source. And Martin Luther, of course, he knows Hebrew because he's translating the Old Testament, knows Hebrew, and he notices all these Hebrew terms in Rotwelsch. And so he says, this is a thieves' language that comes from the Jews. And so that this association of Rotwelsch with Jewishness, and especially in a negative form, then basically runs through the entire written archive of this language all the way to the Nazis. So the Nazis, or some Nazis like my grandfather, was, as you say, was not a big theme for the Nazis, but it in a sense it worked perfectly well for the Nazis, and because there's this long prehistory, so we shouldn't just blame the Nazis for this association. It's something that goes all the way to Martin Luther.
But because there were people like your grandfather in the Nazi regime that were interested in this sort of language, do you know if there were any direct negative consequences for the Rotwelsch-speaking people? I mean, were they persecuted, for example, in the Nazi regime?
They were, absolutely. In fact, the itinerants were one of the first groups to be sent to concentration camps. As I mentioned, I reconstruct biographies of a couple of Rotwelsch speakers from the 17th century to the 20th century, and so a 20th century figure illustrates this very, very nicely. Is a man called Gregor Gog, who drifts into this itinerant lifestyle in the 20th century, and he is inducted into this Rotwelsch language, but he realizes that he wants to organize itinerants into almost like it's unclear, not necessarily political party, but to create this kind of, or to heighten the kind of solidarity of which you earlier spoke, the sense that there was a sense of community, that we all belong to this one group of itinerant Rotwelsch speakers. And so he starts a journal by Rotwelsch speakers. The journal is mostly in German, but there are Rotwelsch terms that get used in that journal. Some itinerants even talk about Rotwelsch as their shared language, and so on and so forth. And he's trying to organize these itinerants, and that's why he's sometimes called the king of the tramps. It was sort of a label that stuck to him. And so this was in the late 20s. And so when the Nazis come to power, they prosecute him and many other itinerants, because for them they're considered asocial, and they're sort of socially disruptive because they're itinerant, and they're associated with the criminal underground, and they're associated with this language. So they get prosecuted. Gregor Gok lands in these early concentration camps that were a little bit more makeshift. So he's able to escape from one, and he escapes to the Soviet Union. So absolutely. So I would say the Nazis prosecuted them not so much because of this language they spoke, because many Nazis who would prosecute them and hunt them down probably didn't care very much about this language. They were just, Nazi as stormtrooper types who hated itinerants. But itinerants definitely were a group explicitly targeted very early on. Yeah.
So just to take a step back, and since you mentioned, for example, also Martin Luther and the sort of negative comments he made about Rotwelsch and Rotwelsch-speaking people, was it the case that since its inception and throughout the Middle Ages and so on, these people were, for example, discriminated by people across Europe, across different European nations? Or, I mean, how were they dealt with by Europeans?
Absolutely. I think they very much what we would now call discriminated against, in part because, this was a period when Europe, when the idea of the nation state emerged after the end of the 30 Years War and the Peace of Westphalia, where you have, from the Middle Ages to, let's say, the 19th century, more and more control of borders, more and more of a sense that if you want to cross a border, you need permission, you need papers, you need identities, you need to have a place in which you live, and so on and so forth. And just by their itinerant lifestyle, the many Rotwelsch speakers violated all of these terms, and this is why they were always in this kind of gray area of legality. And it's true that sometimes they were criminals and so on and so forth, but even when they weren't, they were always in this gray area. So they were, and very much like, another group that had a similar life, but a very different language and a different sense of identity, namely the Sinti and Roma. We can imagine the kind of ire, and often they were also confused. Often they were seen as Sinti or Roma groups because they were also itinerant, and so on and so forth. And in fact, there, as I mentioned, some terms from Romani also migrated into Rotwelsch. So absolutely, there are people who live on the margins who drift into this lifestyle, sometimes deliberately, sometimes through constraints. It's very, very interesting when they start to write about themselves, which only happens really in the 20th century, in that journal put together by the king of the tramps. They speak about their life, certainly a lot in terms of hardship, and that makes total sense. But at the same time, at least some of these writers, also try to embrace it as a positive identity, in a sense that this is a life they have chosen, that they reject modern life with its amenities and so on and so forth. Sometimes it gets a kind of quasi-communist a spin on the way they express that. So you can definitely see, again, it's yet another way in which you can see a sort of identity or group identity or solidarity formed in response to that long history of persecution. Yeah.
Right. So earlier I've asked you about, I asked you basically if there were still any Rotwelsch-speaking people nowadays, but are there any remnants of these people? Any descendants in Europe that still keep this sort of nomadic lifestyle?
Yes. So the answer is yes. And I would have probably 5 years ago, I would have said, I don't think so. But I've come to realize that that's actually wrong. And it's again because we don't see these groups, or we don't want to see them, or they live sort of below our a radar screen. So through sheer coincidence, a newspaper wrote an article about this project of mine when I was sort of in the middle of it, and then different people started to write to me, saying, "Oh, I know some people who still speak versions of this language in this village in southern Germany," or and so on and so forth. So people started to write to me about different sightings, essentially, of Rotwelsh or remnants of Rotwelsh speakers. Um, and the longest and for me most fascinating was that group in Switzerland. And it was I did not meet with them, or could not meet with them directly, but I had a sort of intermediary who did not belong to that group, but had a long family connection to that group. And so had their trust and was able to speak to them and would help them from time to time in various ways and interact with them. So he offered uh, to ask them questions. So I started through him to ask them questions about their language and their life, and became clear that they're very much, they still exist. Um, they still have, they have a huge amount of skepticism and fear of anyone official, police, the state coming in, even researchers. One of the fascinating things they said is, this goes back to this question of a secret language. I said it's not really as much of a secret language as a vehicle for survival and solidarity and so on and so forth, which I believe is true. But that speaker of Yenish, which is sort of a modern version of Rotwelsh, said that they often mislead. If a researcher like me comes along and asks them about their language, they often make up false words or mislead them because they feel like for their own survival, they need to hold on to this language. It's one of their tools and their sort of cultural possessions. Right. And also he said that once they feel like a certain word, meaning of a word has gotten out and is circulating, that they no longer use that word. So that there's a real sense of not interacting with most outsiders, or only very carefully. And it took me a while to process this, but that essentially the difference between someone like me, who's coming from the outside to understand their language, and a policeman who is trying to keep them from, let's say, crossing a certain border, that to their mind, those two are very much in cahoots in some sense. And it's true. Throughout the history of that language, the people who tried to understand this language the most were the police. So there was a very difficult, it's very hard became very hard for me to figure out how to position myself, in a sense, with respect to them.
Right, so just one last question. By studying Rotwelsh, do you think that perhaps by the ways it got influenced by other languages in its inception and across its history, and perhaps the sort of functions it served, the sort of topics people used it to talk the most about, that we can learn more about how languages in general develop and evolve? Do you think we can extrapolate from Rotwelsh to other languages?
Yes, I think so. And that for me was also sort of came as a surprise, because when I started to study it, I thought, oh, this is something completely unique. And that's what drew me to it. This is something, my uncle studied. I have this unique archive. No one knows about it. It's this very specific combination of languages that I've never heard of before, that no one knows about. So I started thinking, this is this very peculiar, very unusual thing, which it still is. But then as I got more and more into it, two things started to happen. The first was that I realized that there are actually lots of underground sociolects like it in other countries. So this was something that, in a way, happens whenever you have a milieu, especially a milieu that's sort of on the outs with settled society that's persecuted in various ways. That milieu is going to just evolve its own sociolect. And it often happens very quickly. And sometimes it may not be as elaborate, it may not be as long as the history of Rotwelsch, but something like that happens all the time. So this seems to say something very general about how humans, how we interact and how we use language for survival, for solidarity, to create meaning, to operate in the world, essentially. And so to see that lots of people, again, some people heard about this project, they said, oh, have you heard about this secret language or that secret language? And so I have a long list of these languages. So from thinking that this is something really unusual, I came away thinking that this is actually the most general, the most universal thing in the world. So that's one sort of general conclusion I drew from it. And the other is that it seemed to say so much about, I started to think of it as a language of migration, in part because the speakers were itinerant and migrated, but also because there's so many different languages that got sort of combined in the lives of these speakers. And it just seemed to be, even though there are not many speakers left, although some, and it's been fascinating to see how resilient this language is, it also seemed to sort of resonate with our world more generally, where we have more and more migration for various political reasons, environmental reasons, and where I think we have to somehow start to come to grips mentally and in every other respect with the movement of peoples and languages. And somehow Rotwelsch, though emerging from a very particular time and place in many ways, and one that seems very remote from us, seemed to be a kind of interesting test case or example of what that migration and fluidity of peoples and languages could be. So that became for me the other way in which this very obscure and very remote and very specialized thing suddenly seemed to resonate with our world in ways that surprised me.
Okay, good. So the book is again The Language of Thieves, My Family's Obsession with the Secret Code the Nazis Tried to Eliminate. Before we go, Dr. Puchner, would you like to mention where people can find your work on the internet?
Oh, sure. I mean, I have a website, martinpuchner.com, but just my first and last name. And there, you'll find lots of information there. Martin Puchner, I have a Twitter and also on Facebook. Please connect with me. My last book, O Mundo da Escrita, was translated into Portuguese. I was very happy for that. So you can find that also.
Okay, great. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Hi everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. So, to keep the channel sustainable and to keep it running, I would like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page. You have all sorts of benefits there, and any amount, even just $1, would already be a great help. You also have links to PayPal in the description box. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska, Anne Blanchett, Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arnold Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Enrique Lenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Forrest Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columba, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreeff, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roch, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonho Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Ellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, my producers Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sérgio Quadraiano, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardes France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.